Welcome to this class on monosynaptic reflexes. This is part 2. We were talking about in the previous class the relationship between the stimulus amplitude and the response amplitude for the two different cases of the responses that we saw, the H reflex and the M response or the M wave. Why does this happen? We did not discuss why it happens. We need to discuss why it happens. And then the mechanical analog of the H reflex, or more precisely H reflex is the electrical analog of the mechanical response, or the tendon tap reflex, which is also called as the T reflex. And then what happens to monosynaptic reflexes, especially the H reflex, when there is voluntary muscle activation? So is reflex amplitude always the same? How is that affected? How is that modulated? And why is that important? That is the third topic. And then we will talk about a very special case where an action potential backfires and produces another action potential from the alpha motor neuron or the F wave. We will discuss these kind of things. Okay. So we saw in the previous class what we saw was that as the stimulus amplitude increased, H reflex amplitude continued to increase, and at some point it started reducing, and we said that is the non-monotonic case, is it not? That is the non-monotonic case of the H reflex. This is wrong. It is actually blue is actually H reflex and red is M response. Okay. This is M response. We saw that as I increase the amplitude of the stimulus, so this is the stimulus amplitude, this is in volts actually, this is the response, is it not? And what we see is that as I increase the stimulus amplitude, the response continues to increase until some point, and after some point it starts to decrease like that, is it not? Actually it is a relatively more smooth curve. Here we have drawn with a fewer points, which is why you are seeing a non-smooth curve here, but what happens is a smooth response like that. So this is the relationship between stimulus amplitude and response amplitude, whereas in the case of M response, for a while around until that point the response does not start, there is no M response, and then M response starts, and when it starts to increase it keeps increasing monotonically, and at some point it saturates. Of course at some point it must saturate, but it does not go back. That is the most important part, like in H reflex. The question is why H reflex amplitude starts reducing after that point. It starts reducing and at some point it becomes 0. For all these cases H reflex amplitude is 0. Why? Let us go back to the case of what happens, how this H reflex is produced, and remind ourselves of the mechanism, the physiological mechanism. That is probably the reason why. Let us try to discuss that in a bit. So what happens? So here is a case where this is a slide for voluntary activation, but we will just discuss H reflex here. We are stimulating the muscle nerve, and the first neurons to get stimulated are the largest 1A afferents. Stimulation intensity, as I increase the stimulation voltage, the smaller 1A afferents are also going to be responding, and after some time there is going to be a muscle response, right. So that muscle response is what is recorded here. This is H reflex response. We said this is actually an EMG, this is muscle activity that is and the stimulus is applied approximately here, is it not? So the stimulus is applied here, and I keep increasing the stimulus amplitude. What happens is, as I keep increasing the stimulus amplitude, more and more 1A afferents start getting recruited, right. After some time what happens, the alpha motor neuron, so this is the alpha motor neuron, their axons start getting recruited, their axons are stimulated, and the response, if the stimulation is given here, the response travels in two directions, the action potential travels in that direction as well as in that direction. This distance is shorter, there is going to be smaller delay for the muscle response, that is what you see as the M response here. See, now this is what we discussed in the previous class. Now I am continuing to increase the amplitude because the response is not going to, the delay in the response is not going to change because this distance is going to be the same unless I move the stimulating point. This distance is going to be the same, so this delay will be the same, but as I increase the amplitude, more and more of these alpha motor neuronal axons will start getting recruited, and so the response amplitude will keep increasing, the M response amplitude will keep increasing monotonically. The smallest alpha motor neuron or the alpha motor neuron with the smallest diameter, until it gets recruited, the amplitude can be increased, and as the stimulus amplitude keeps increasing, the response will keep increasing, which is what you see as the red plot here, which is what you see as that plot, this response. So, it is a relatively monotonic response. This is what happens with M response. The question is not that, the question is what happens with H reflex. Why does it show a non-monotonic response? After that point there is a reduction in amplitude, and actually at around that point it becomes 0. Why does this happen? Let us remind ourselves one more time what happens here. There is, this is monosynaptic response, H reflex is monosynaptic, M response does not involve any synapse other than the neuromuscular synapse, because it directly, this is direct response or the direct stimulation direct response case. This is M response, here that involves one synapse, which is why we call it as the monosynaptic case. So as and when we stimulate this afferent, this is what gets stimulated, then whenever we say synapse, there are several things that are involved immediately, is it not? Let us remind ourselves the case of the synapse, how synapse works. There is a neurotransmitter that is packed in a vesicle, and this neurotransmitter will need to be released, and that release is governed by the membrane around the synaptic end bulb and its properties. So if that membrane goes to depolarization, calcium channels are going to open and calcium is going to enter, and then that is going to be detected, and then the vesicles are going to move and exocytose the neurotransmitter or send the neurotransmitter molecule, send the into the synaptic cleft, after which this chemical diffuses through the cleft, which is a small gap, and reaches the receptor, and then the receptor detects and then opens and sodium enters. This is the story of the synapse, is it not? So that means there is a relatively small delay associated with the chemical synapses. This delay is about 0.5 milliseconds, but it is not just the delay, there are several things that control the how much can this be pushed, to what extent you can push this. The other thing that could happen, several one-year friends are this motor neuron can receive inputs from several sources, is it not? It could have multiple dendrites, and there could be both temporal and spatial summation. If for example there is action potential travelling in two directions, if I am stimulating here, we said this is orthodromic conduction and there is antidromic conduction, but what also happens is that there is action potential that is generated due to this synapse that is travelling in that direction. If they meet with appropriate phase or out of phase, it is possible that they could extinguish each other. What happens is that there is an absolute refractory period for channels. So when, let us now take I am going to zoom out that zone for you to see there, okay. Now that is the membrane there, okay. In this membrane one action potential is travelling due to, this is the alpha motor neuronal axon, one more action potential is travelling on the alpha motor neuronal axon, other action potential is travelling on the alpha motor neuronal soma, okay, for example in two different directions. Suppose that is a sodium channel, voltage gated sodium channel, okay. And there is another several of these voltage, strategically placed voltage gated sodium channels are present, and which is what causes the propagation of action potential, as we have seen, right. So as this reaches that point, as this action potential reaches that point, it is going to cause depolarization and a lot of sodium is going to come in. At around the same time, if this reaches this point, right, lot of sodium is going to come in and depolarization is going to travel in that direction, and depolarization from here is going to travel in that direction. If for example this guy reaches just slightly early, then a lot of sodium will enter, that is okay. After that, the inactivation gate of this channel will close. We saw that the activation gate and inactivation gate are simultaneously activated when the depolarization is reached. The activation gate opens immediately because it is a rapid process, the inactivation gate slowly closes. As the inactivation gate is closed, if this action potential reaches when the inactivation gate is closed or during the absolute refractory period, it is not possible for this part of the membrane to go to depolarization anymore. This action potential will get extinguished at that point, it will no longer travel. So these two action potentials, in other words, action potentials can meet each other and extinguish each other. Of course, there are conditions as to when or how this will happen. This will happen only when these two action potentials reach in each other's or in mutual refractory periods. If it causes refractory period and the other action potential is arriving during a refractory period, it is not possible for this action potential to add up, or in other words, these are out of phase, and so they will subtract each other and it could practically go to 0. But this could happen only in a few of 1A afferents and alpha motor neurons, but not others, which is why what you will see is as the stimulus amplitude is increased in some of these 1A afferents and alpha motor neurons, this will happen, or this phenomenon that was just now explained will happen, and a smaller amplitude response is seen, but the others will continue to respond. But soon as the amplitude of stimulation keeps increasing, at some point this will happen in practically all the cases, because all of them will have two action potentials traveling in either direction, almost all of them. Let us once again remember that the H reflex is the net response, not an individual neuron's response or an individual muscle fibers response, is the response to a stimulation. So I am stimulating with a given amplitude, what is the response that is felt in the muscle? That is the response that is recorded. So that is response of several alpha motor neurons, is it not just one alpha motor neuron. So depending on the amplitude of the stimulation, the response characteristic will start reducing because of what was just now explained, because of this mechanism, and after some time it will practically extinguish. This is what happens here. So that the response of the H reflex starts reducing here, and it continues to reduce because of that same mechanism, and at some point it becomes 0. There is no more this. So there is no more fuel for this to happen, as in no more sodium that is present. Because of this reason, it is not possible for H reflex amplitude to keep on increasing. There is a non-monotonic response of the H reflex, and at some point it becomes 0. Whereas the M, you might ask, why does this not happen in the M response case? In the case of M response, the response is traveling in that direction, is it not? There is no opposite action potential that is traveling in this direction from the muscle, that does not happen. So the possibility that an M response is going to be extinguished is close to 0, is it not? So, but why does it become saturated? In other words, why does that happen? Why does this happen? Because at some point I have recruited practically all the alpha motor neurons. I cannot increase the alpha motor neuronal response anymore. I have recruited everybody, all of them are firing. The only thing that I can do after that is keep reducing the time between the stimuli, for example. And we also saw what could happen if I increase the frequency of stimulation. If I increase the frequency of stimulation, what happens is that the H reflex rate goes, or the H reflex amplitude keeps reducing after some time, right. So why? Because of similar mechanisms. Please do read about this. So but at least I have given you a start to read, okay. So this is why the M response has a monotonic increase with stimulus intensity, whereas the H reflex shows a non-monotonic response. This is critical difference between M response and H reflex because of the physiological basis why this happens, okay. And note, this is not going to affect the timing of the appearances. Timing is going to be approximately the same. Timing is not going to change, just the amplitudes are going to change. And we saw what is we discussed, at least introduced in the previous class, what will happen if a tendon is tapped with a small hammer. There is going to be a jerk, or what is called as a knee jerk response, right. This is called as the tendon response or the T reflex. The electrical analog of this T reflex is the H reflex, or the T reflex is a monosynaptic reflex, that is, so if I tap the tendon, then the muscle spindle feels as if muscle spindle senses the stretch, sudden stretch, and then immediately one afferents, that is the muscle spindle feel, that is there, and immediately one afferents will start firing and command the alpha motor neuron to contract. That response is what is felt as the knee jerk response. So, and that response and approximately that delay, that delta t will be the same as the H reflex, approximately the same as the H reflex response. Why? Because the pathway involved is the same, is it not? There is an 1A afferent and there is a alpha motor neuronal pathway. So all since these things remain the same, the timing remains the same, okay. Now the question is, what will happen if there is voluntary muscle activation or some voluntary movement is performed during, what will happen to the amplitude of the reflexes during voluntary movements? Usually what happens is, if there is voluntary activation, the H reflex amplitude goes up, the M response amplitude remains the same. In other words, if there is voluntary activation of the muscle, the H reflex amplitude increases when compared with the case of no voluntary activation. Without voluntary activation, if the response is so much, with voluntary activation the response is going to be much higher, but that difference is not going to be seen in the M response. So what does this mean? Why does this happen? What is going to be the physiological mechanism behind this? Once again, this is due to the pathways that are involved. Let us remember one more time, the H reflex pathway involves the 1A afferent and the synapse, whereas the M response pathway only involves the alpha motor neuronal axon, or at least about half of it actually. So because of this differences, fundamental differences in the physiology, the difference in the amplitude happens. Please check what that difference is. So another thing that could happen is, what could happen in the case of maneuvers, this so called Gendrasic maneuver, right. So this is the case where we keep the two hands clenched with each other, and I am just pulling like that very tightly. I am trying to pull the two hands away from each other. In this case, many muscles will be activated. At that time, if we test the H reflex response of the lower body or some other relatively distant muscles, what you will see is that an increase, usually an increase in the H reflex response, or the amplitude of the H reflex will change, right. Why does this happen? Again, so the question is out there, why this happens. At least what is known is that this voluntary activation of multiple muscles, or a maneuver that activates many muscles, usually causes an increase, definitely causes a change in the H reflex amplitude, usually causes an increase in the H reflex response. Again, we need to check why. Now the other question is, can I somehow modulate the H reflex response? can I train people to change the amplitude? You see, this is a monosynaptic reflex, or in other words, this involves just two neurons on one synapse, or as in the 1A afferent and alpha motor neuron. These are the two neurons and just one synapse between them. This is what is involved here. Now again, not counting the neuromuscular synapse, not counting the neuromuscular synapse. So if you want to train, you are talking about training a specific set of neurons, just two neurons among billions. So many neurons are there, but you want to train a specific set of, or a specific pair of neurons. Training this is a very tedious process, but the question is not that. The question is, can the amplitude be changed based on training? That is the question. The answer is yes, but with substantial training. This kind of research is pioneered by Professor Jonathan Wolpa. Those who are interested in this topic can check this, and other colleagues. Do check the publications of Professor Jonathan Wolpa. So, who has published on how you could change even the response of the monosynaptic reflex. Even that can be modulated, can be changed with substantial training, not with a small amount of training. Substantial training can be changed. If the question is, can this be trained, the answer is yes, but not easy. It is going to take substantial amount of training. Of course, what happens with voluntary activation, we have seen it can be changed, but without voluntary activation, for the same stimulus, can I change the response? If that is the question, then that needs training, because otherwise this response is going to be the same. There must be sufficient time for this synapse to recover. The mediator involved in a synapse is the neurotransmitter. It is packed in vesicles, and once all the neurotransmitter is finished, it takes non-zero amount of time for that to be packed in vesicles one more time, to be regenerated. It is not like you can, this is available instantaneously and in unlimited quantities. No. So because of this reason, there are other things that come into the picture into this. Please do read about this. Okay. The other case is a very, very special case. We said what could happen with stimulation. If I stimulate an alpha motor neuron in the middle, then there is going to be an antidromic conduction in that direction, and we said that could, and it does, extinguish the H reflex mediated response. So, now what is not shown here is the H reflex mediated response to 1A, for example. Okay. Now that could extinguish that, but suppose I keep increasing the stimulus amplitude. First, what happens is that if I stimulate, there is going to be an orthodromic action potential that travels from the point of stimulation to the muscle. That is what is felt as the M response. But then there is also an antidromic action potential that travels from, because if I stimulate an axon in the middle, action potential is going to travel in both directions. So action potential will travel, if I stimulate here, action potential will travel in that direction as well as in this direction, is it not? In both directions. Now is it possible that this action potential could reach there and cause one more action potential here at the axon hillock? Again, this due to the vagaries, due to the peculiarities involved in the generation of action potential at the axon hillock, this is purely dependent on the timing at which it arrives. In some cases, what happens is that this antidromic action potential reaches the axon hillock and causes a new action potential to be generated here, and that action potential will travel orthodromically in that direction and reach the muscle. That is felt here. That is the F way. This response, in other words, so what this means is that this antidromic action potential goes to the neuron and then the neuron backfires. So neurons can backfire. So, this again depends purely on the timing. If there is sufficient time, or if it arrives during a refractory period, obviously there is not going to be any backfiring, but if it does not happen and if there is sufficient fuel, if there is sufficient probability that this could happen, then it will happen. So, it is not a sure case, but in some cases this does happen, is it not? So, this case is the case of F wave. Okay. If I were to compare the latency of the M response, F wave and H reflex, let us remind ourselves, the M response will arrive earlier. Why? Because it travels a shorter distance. The F wave will arrive next. Why? Because it goes and come back. When will the H reflex arrive? If there is that. Anybody would guess, an intelligent guess would be the following: the H reflex would arrive after here, if at all it arrives. Why? Because, or in other words, F response timing is going to be slightly earlier than the H reflexes, just slightly ahead of the H reflexes timing, if at all there is an H reflex. So, this is the H. Why this difference? You see, the pathway involved in the H reflex is a longer pathway with only a front and a synaptic delay, but the pathway involved with the F response is the same alpha motor neuronal axon. There is no synapse that is involved. Because of this reason, if at all there is going to be a H reflex, that is going to arrive later in time. So, that is going to arrive after the F wave. If at all it is going to be there, it is going to come later, or in other words, the latency of the F wave is going to be slightly smaller, slightly lesser than the H reflex latency. Of course, the M response latency will be much lesser, of course. So, in summary, what we have seen is the relationship between the amplitude of the response and the amplitude of the stimulus, or in other words, if I increase the stimulus amplitude, H reflex shows that kind of a non-monotonic response, whereas M response shows that kind of a monotonic response. So, and we saw why this happens. This happens because of the refractory periods involved, or because of that reason the amplitude keeps reducing as I keep increasing the stimulus amplitude, the response amplitude keeps reducing in the H reflex, but not in M response. And we saw what is the T reflex, or the tendon tap reflex, and we saw what happens with voluntary activation. With voluntary activation, there is going to be modulation, that is going usually an increase in the amplitude of the monosynaptic reflex without affecting the timing involved. And we saw what is an F wave, the peculiar case of a neuron backfiring. Why do we do all these things? That is the question. Finally, there must be a reason why we do all these things. It turns out that this or these latencies and amplitudes are relatively comparable among individuals and also groups of individuals, more importantly. So, with this we come to the end of this class. So, thank you very much.